This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Carl Manchester, 2007. Essays in Radical Empiricism by William James. Chapter 11. Humanism and Truth, Once More. Mr. Joseph's criticism of my article, Humanism and Truth, is a useful contribution to the general clearing up. Footnote. Humanism and Truth first appeared in Mind, October 1904. It is reprinted in The Meaning of Truth. Mr. H. W. B. Joseph's criticism, entitled Professor James on Humanism and Truth, appeared in Mind, January 1905. End footnote. He has seriously tried to comprehend what the pragmatic movement may intelligibly mean, and if he has failed, it is the fault neither of his patience nor of his sincerity, but rather of stubborn tricks of thought which he could not easily get rid of. Minute polemics, in which the parties try to rebut every detail of each other's charges, are a useful exercise only to the disputants. They can but breed confusion in a reader. I will therefore ignore as much as possible the text of both our articles, mine was inadequate enough, and treat once more the general objective situation. As I apprehend the movement towards humanism, it is based on no particular discovery or principle that can be driven into one precise formula, which thereupon can be impaled upon a logical skewer. It is much more like one of those secular changes that come upon public opinion overnight, as it were, borne upon tides too full for sound or foam, that survive all the crudities and extravagances of their advocates, that you can pin to no one absolutely essential statement, nor kill by any one decisive stab. Such have been the changes from aristocracy to democracy, from classic to romantic taste, from theistic to pantheistic feeling, from static to evolutionary ways of understanding life, changes of which we have all been spectators. Scholasticism still opposes to such changes the method of confutation by single decisive reasons, showing that the new view involves self-contradiction, or traverses some fundamental principle. This is like stopping a river by planting a stick in the middle of its bed. Round your obstacle flows the water, and gets there all the same. In reading Mr. Joseph, I am not a little reminded of those Catholic writers who refute Darwinism by telling us that higher species cannot come from lower, because minus nequit gignere plus, or that the notion of transformation is absurd, for it implies that species tend to their own destruction, and that would violate the principle that every reality tends to persevere in its own shape. The point of view is too myopic, too tight and close, to take in the inductive argument. You cannot settle questions of fact by formal logic. I feel as if Mr. Joseph almost pounced on my words singly, without giving the sentences time to get out of my mouth. The one condition of understanding humanism is to become inductive-minded oneself, to drop rigorous definitions and follow lines of least resistance on the whole. In other words, Mr. Joseph may probably say, resolve your intellect into a kind of slush. Even so I make reply, if you will consent to use no politer word. For humanism, conceiving the more true as the more satisfactory, Dewey's term, has to renounce sincerely rectilinear arguments and ancient ideals of rigour and finality. It is in just this temper of renunciation, so different from that of Pyrrhonistic scepticism, that the spirit of humanism essentially consists. Satisfactoriness has to be measured by a multitude of standards, of which some, for aught we know, may fail in any given case, and what is more satisfactory than any alternative in sight may to the end be a sum of pluses and minuses, concerning which we can only trust that by ulterior corrections and improvements a maximum of the one and a minimum of the other may some day be approached. It means a real change of heart, a break with absolutistic hopes, when one takes up this view of the conditions of belief. That humanism's critics have never imagined this attitude inwardly is shown by their invariable tactics. They do not get into it far enough to see objectively and from without what their own opposite notion of truth is. Mr. Joseph is possessed by some such notion. He thinks his readers to be full of it. He obeys it, works from it, but never even essays to tell us what it is. The nearest he comes to doing so is where he says it is the way we ought to think, whether we be psychologically compelled to or not. Of course, humanism agrees to this. It is only a manner of calling truth an ideal. But humanism explicates the summarising word ought into a mass of pragmatic motives, from the midst of which our critics think that truth itself takes flight. Truth is a name of double meaning. It stands now for an abstract something, defined only as that to which our thought ought to conform, and again it stands for the concrete propositions within which we believe that conformity already reigns, they being so many truths. Humanism sees that the only conformity we ever have to deal with concretely is that between our subjects and our predicates, using these words in a very broad sense. It sees, moreover, that this conformity is validated, to use Mr. Schiller's term, by an indefinite number of pragmatic tests that vary as the predicates and subjects vary. If an S gets superseded by an SP, that gives our mind a completer sum of satisfactions. We always say humanism points out that we have advanced to a better position in regard to truth. Now many of our judgments thus attained are retrospective. The S's, so the judgment runs, were SPs already ere the fact was humanly recorded. Common sense, struck by this state of things, now rearranges the whole field, and traditional philosophy follows her example. The general requirement that predicates must conform to their subject, they translate into an ontological theory. A most previous subject of all is substituted for the lesser subjects and conceived of as an archetypal reality, and the conformity required of predicates in detail is reinterpreted as a relation which our whole mind, with all its subjects and predicates together, must get into with respect to this reality. It, meanwhile, is conceived as eternal, static, and unaffected by our thinking. Conformity to a non-human archetype like this is probably the notion of truth which my opponent shares with common sense and philosophic rationalism. Now when humanism, fully admitting both the naturalness and the grandeur of this hypothesis, nevertheless points to its sterility, and declines to chime in with its substitution, keeping to the concrete and still lodging truth between the subjects and the predicates in detail, it provokes the outcry which we hear and which my critic echoes. One of the commonest parts of the outcry is that humanism is subjectivistic altogether. It is supposed to labour under a necessity of denying transperceptual reality. It is not hard to see how this misconception of humanism may have arisen, and humanistic writers, partly from not having sufficiently guarded their expressions, and partly from not having yet got round, in the poverty of their literature, to a full discussion of the subject, are doubtless in some degree to blame. But I fail to understand how anyone with a working grasp of their principles can charge them wholesale with subjectivism. I myself have never thought of humanism as being subjectivistic farther than to this extent that, in so much as it treats the thinker as being himself one portion of reality, it must also allow that some of the realities that he declares for true are created by his being there. Such realities, of course, are either acts of his, or relations between other things and him, or relations between things which, but for him, would never have been traced. Humanists are subjectivistic also in this, that, unlike rationalists, who think they carry a warrant for the absolute truth of what they now believe in their present pocket, they hold all present beliefs as subject to revision in the light of future experience. The future experience, however, may be of things outside the thinker, and that this is so the humanist may believe as freely as any other kind of empiricist philosopher. The critics of humanism, though here I follow them but darkly, appear to object to any infusion whatever of subjectivism into truth. All must be archetypal. Every truth must pre-exist to its perception. Humanism sees that an enormous quantity of truth must be written down as having pre-existed to its perception by us humans,